Welcome to this channel. In this video, we will walk you through creating a simple and interactive Excel dashboard. We will use pivot tables, pivot charts, and slicers to create this amazing interactive dashboard. Let's get started. So here's our data set, which we downloaded from Kaggle. It features automobile sales in the UAE and contains 27 columns and a little over 9,900 rows of data. Since this data set has already been cleaned with no empty rows or columns, we will go ahead to format it as a table. To format as a table, the keyboard shortcut is Ctrl-T. This table has headers, so we click on OK. We will go ahead and name this table as Dataset. We formatted the source data as an Excel table because this ensures that any changes made to the source data, such as adding or deleting rows or columns, will automatically be reflected in the pivot tables we are about to create. We will now proceed to create our pivot tables. To create the pivot table, we will simply click on Summarize with Pivot Table. It has correctly detected the table range, and we are going to place the pivot table on a new worksheet, so we will click OK. This will be our first pivot table, so let's go ahead and rename this pivot table as Pivot Table 1. We will also rename the sheet as Pivot Table 1. Renaming pivot tables and sheets with descriptive names of our choice makes it easy to reference them later when we are building our dashboard and need to connect various pivot charts to our slicers. So since for this pivot table, we will create a line chart showing sales by seller type over the years. We will go ahead to select seller type, year, and price. Before we plot our charts, let's format these as numbers. A simple way to do this is by right-clicking on any of the numbers and selecting Number Format. We will go ahead to select Number under the category. We will set the number of decimal places to 0, choose to use the thousand separator, and then click OK. Now that our pivot table is formatted, we will proceed to select our pivot chart. To do this, simply click on the Pivot Table Analyze tab and choose Pivot Chart. We will select Line and click OK. Since we will be using slicers, we don't need field buttons. Therefore, we will remove all field buttons by right-clicking on any of the field buttons on the chart and selecting Hide All Field Buttons on Chart. We will place the legend at the top and include a chart title. Let's name this chart as Sales by Seller Type. We used a line chart for this pivot table because it is the best way to visualize data that changes over time, which in this case, the changes in car sales per seller type over time. Let's move on to create our next pivot table and chart. To ensure that all our pivot charts share the same source data, we'll simply copy the Pivot Table 1 sheet. To do this, press and hold the Control key while right-clicking and dragging to create a duplicate of the first pivot table. Let's go ahead and rename this sheet as Pivot Table 2. Let's also rename the pivot table as Pivot Table 2. We are not using a line chart for our second pivot chart, so let's go ahead to delete it. We don't need the year and seller type as well, so let's go ahead and remove them. We want to create a pie chart of sales by transmission type, so let's go ahead and add transmission type to the rows field. We will proceed to select our chart just as we did previously. In this case, we'll choose a pie. Additionally, just like the previous chart, we will remove all field buttons, place the legend at the top, and name the chart Sales by Transmission Type. Pie charts are particularly useful for displaying the proportion of each category as part of a whole, and are best used when the number of categories is small, ideally not more than 6. Moving on to the next pivot table and pivot chart, we will essentially repeat the same process by copying pivot table 2 sheet. Again, we will rename the sheet and the pivot table just as we did previously. For this pivot table, we will compare the vehicle sales data based on 2 criteria: fuel types and transmission types. Since we're not using the pie chart for this analysis, let's go ahead and delete it. We will also move transmission type to the columns field and fuel type to the rows field. Let's proceed to create our pivot chart. Column charts are my favorite type of charts due to its versatility and their ability to display multiple criteria side by side or stacked, depending on the comparison needed. They also facilitate quick and easy interpretation of trends and differences between categories, and users can easily identify which criterion has higher or lower values based on the column heights. Notice that the column heights are not arranged from largest to smallest. We will arrange them from largest to smallest by right-clicking on any of the columns and selecting Sort Largest to Smallest. The next 2 pivot charts will pretty much follow the same steps as we did for pivot table 3. We will now proceed to plot our final pivot chart. For our final pivot chart, we will be analyzing car sales per vehicle brand. There are a large number of categories for vehicle brand, So analyzing this data with a column chart can be difficult to read, as you'll see shortly. Instead, we will use a bar chart since the horizontal layout provides more space for category labels, making it easier to read long names without clutter. Another simple way to change the chart type is to right-click on the chart and select Change Chart Type. We will go ahead to sort the data from largest to smallest to make it easier to read and compare. Let's also resize the chart a little bit due to the large number of categories, so it is easier to read. So now that we've finished plotting our pivot charts, let's proceed to build our dashboard. We will create our dashboard on a new sheet. First, we will design the header of the dashboard. We will name this dashboard as UAE Auto Market Sales Dashboard. We will go ahead and change the font size and also add some color fill. Next thing we will do is copy all the charts to the dashboard sheet. We have covered the two main components of this dashboard, pivot tables and pivot charts. Now, let's move on to the final component, slicers. Slicers provide an intuitive and visual way for us to filter our data and also allow us to interact with multiple pivot charts simultaneously. We can insert slicers into this dashboard in multiple ways. Two options include inserting them from the Pivot Chart Analyze tab or from the Insert tab. For this dashboard, we will select Year, Transmission Type, and Seller Type. You can select more or less slicers based on your specific needs. Now that we have our charts and slicers on our dashboard sheet, we have everything we need to work on the layout so it looks aesthetically pleasing. Okay, the dashboard is coming along nicely. Let's go ahead and remove the grid lines so the dashboard looks cleaner, more professional, and visually appealing. To do this, simply go to the View tab and uncheck the grid lines option. Everything is looking nice and professional. The one thing we still need to do is link our slicers to our pivot charts to enable interactivity. As you can see, only the sales per brand chart is changing when we filter with our slicers because it is the only chart currently linked to the slicers. Let's go ahead and link the remaining charts to the slicers. To do this, right-click on the slicer you want to link to the charts, select Report Connections, and check all the pivot charts you want to link to that particular slicer. For the sake of this analysis and dashboard, we may not have used very descriptive names for our pivot tables and pivot charts. However, in a real-life project where you might want to link specific pivot charts to particular slicers, it's important to use more descriptive names to easily distinguish between the various pivot charts. This brings us to the end of this dashboard tutorial. One last point to mention is refreshing your pivot tables when the data source is updated. By default, pivot tables are not automatically refreshed when new data is added to your data set. However, you can manually refresh the data at any time by selecting Refresh in the Pivot Chart Analyze tab to update the workbook. All said and done, while this may not be the most fanciest Excel dashboard, the goal of this tutorial was to demonstrate how to create a simple Excel dashboard. Thanks for watching this tutorial, and I hope you found it useful. Please like this video and subscribe to this channel for more content like this in the future.